Okay, so now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's Public Affairs Research Practice. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am joined today by Mercedes Bender from our strategy team. We will be jointly presenting this data. I'll be leading off looking at some of the data, some of the things that are essentially driving this push for brands to take political and values-based positions. And then I'll hand it over to Mercedes to talk a little bit about sort of how to really think about DEI issues and how to help your brand navigate this really trying and challenging climate. And then hopefully we will have time at the end for questions. So as Ellen said, if you do have any questions at any time, you can use the application to enter them, and Mercedes and I will answer as many as possible at the end. Any that we don't get to, of course, we'll send you an email after the webinar to make sure that you get your response. So let's dive in. So the agenda, like I said, social trends, that's me, and then what should you do, that's Mercedes. This is all actually built off of a Ipsos point of view that was published just before the holidays that's available on our website. Certainly encourage you to go check that out. It is sort of a very short encapsulation of this whole discussion into a several page document. It's a great thing to have at your side to sort of think about how you navigate brands through this particular moment in time. So let's jump in. So first off, let's look at some data that we have. This is the Ipsos main problem question. We track this every month. This is actually from December. We just came out with new numbers a few days ago, but they show pretty much the same thing. And what I'm really trying to illustrate with this is that right now in America, people see a very large array of issues, a very large number of things challenging them. The economy, of course, is the sort of the plurality concern. We see 20% or so saying that that's their number one issue, particularly with inflation, cost of living things. But you see a number of other topics are also considered the number one issue, the most important problem for Americans, ranging from immigration to crime to the environment, to inequality, even down to issues like morality, abortion, which has actually been politically very important, even if it's not huge in terms of the number one issue, or education. And all of these issues are sort of coming together to create an environment where Americans feel like there are a lot of needs to be addressed. There's a lot of challenges in front of the country and needs to be addressed. And yet, at the same time, Americans are frustrated with the system. They don't necessarily believe the system is able to address these needs and these challenges that face the country. We see, this is from a long-running series of questions Ipsos has done that we call our System is Broken Index. And we can see that 2/3 of Americans or more agree with a number of questions suggesting their distrust in sort of the establishment, their distrust in the system, from the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and the powerful, 64%, to traditional parties and politicians don't care, 64%, the America needs a strong leader, 65%, the mainstream media is more interested in money than the truth, 74%. And you see that's a relatively bipartisan agreement with these sentiments. So it's not something that's really isolated to one side or the other. And indeed, we'll sort of see this reoccur throughout this discussion, that even though Republicans and Democrats are oftentimes motivated by vastly different views of something, they actually end up holding something like similar positions on these sort of structural or systemic issues facing the country. So in this environment where people don't necessarily trust the establishment, what happens? Well, we've actually seen the private sector has maintained a relatively high level of trust, even as the public sector government institutions has lost ground. This is from the General Social Survey. It's a long-running social science survey going back to the 70s. And this is a data point asking, do people have confidence in the people running major companies or the executive branch? This is people have a great deal or some confidence, so a relatively broad description. You can see the executive branch of the federal government, so the presidency basically has declined relatively steadily since Watergate, since the 70s. And at the same time, the private sector, major companies, has been relatively stable. It's gone up and down a little bit, of course, but you can see 78% as of the most recent set of data in 2022 saying that they trust major companies. And this probably shouldn't really be surprising when we think about how trust is built with Americans. It's built through regular positive interactions. Major companies are able to sort of do that, particularly sort of consumer companies where people are having sort of those, you're buying products, you're sort of interacting with them, and they're able to sort of generate a positive goodwill at the same time that the public sector is reeled from a number of crises, a number of challenges, and essentially deals with sort of just a poor reputation writ large. So we have this situation where people feel like there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of challenges, they think that the system is broken, they don't trust the public sector to fix it. So what has happened is that we're seeing an increasing number of Americans turning to the private sector to drive positive change, to essentially fix these problems with society. And that's the place we're in right now, is we're seeing people looking for someone to offer solutions. And that oftentimes essentially puts brands and companies in the position, in that driver's seat, in that position to sort of lead on fixing these issues facing the country. And we see that throughout where, a significant minority of Americans say that they are driven, their consumer behavior is driven by their values. They choose to support a business or choose not to support a business based on political or social values. And we see more affluent consumers are even more likely to say that. So essentially the people who drive the consumer economy, affluent consumers, very much values driven, values based in sort of their views. So we have a situation where, again, we're seeing consumers driving interests, driving companies to sort of take positions to deal with big challenges. And that has an impact on how people view companies. We see here, this is some relatively recent data, and this is essentially just how favorable people's attitudes are towards various companies by if they're Democrats or Republicans. And you can see various brands skew Republican or Democratic based on how liked they are. So Disney, more liked by Democrats. That's probably a consequence of the fights that they've had with Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. ExxonMobil and most energy companies skew Republican. Anheuser-Busch, Democratic. Whole Foods, Starbucks, ESPN, a number of other things, Democratic. But you can see there is this partisan skew that exists in how people are viewing companies as a consequence of this sort of drive to take political positions. And it's important as companies engage into this area to understand that politics isn't something that's isolated to election day or isolated to campaign ads or the pages of major media. It infects some telling language there. It impacts just about everything. This is our consumer confidence tracking data going back from June 2020 through June 2021, broken out by party ID. Now, I think the thing that's really notable from this is that if you look at the gray line, that's everybody. Consumer sentiment was actually pretty flat over this time period. It trailed up a little bit in early 2021, essentially as the vaccine campaign sort of made us all think we could get back to normal. But there's this really pronounced flip in Republican and Democratic sentiment that occurs in November 2020. Now, if you may remember, November 2020 didn't necessarily see any major economic events, but there was a huge political event, and that election occurred where Joe Biden won, Donald Trump lost, and then a few months later, the inauguration day, Joe Biden is inaugurated as president. What we see there is essentially Republican and Democratic consumer sentiment. Again, these are not questions asking anything about politics. They're just asking, do you feel good about your personal finances? Do you think the country's economy is doing well? Flipped at that time period. And it's almost entirely due to politics, almost entirely due to who was president at that given moment in time. And we see that phenomenon in just about everything that is touched by politics, which is just about everything. So going back to that previous slide I showed you, again, these are all instances where politics have touched organizations and have politicized their view. When we did a similar survey like this a few years ago, Disney was actually slightly more Republican than Democrat, but Disney has pushed towards the Democratic direction really as a consequence of some of the political fights they've been in recently. So what happens then in this environment, right? We have people looking to the private sector to solve problems, but then at the same time wanting the private sector to stay politically neutral, because even consumers do recognize that politics are somewhat caustic, that it's an environment where anyone who sort of touches it can really get damaged, particularly Republicans wanting to see companies remain neutral. I think that's not necessarily because Republicans truly think companies should remain neutral. It's just that Republicans right now believe that companies are more liberal than they are. And if you had changed the sort of set of companies, if you were asking just about ExxonMobil, you probably see different results. But essentially people don't really think that companies should be getting explicitly involved in politics, even as they are looking to companies to solve some of these social challenges that we have. And finally, before I hand it over to Mercedes here, this does have some real world impacts. And what we're seeing is increasing politically driven consumer behavior. So this is essentially just search for the term boycott on Google over the past decade. And you can see that there's been spikes, of course, when particular boycotts have happened, but the trend line is up. Americans are increasingly engaging in politically influenced consumer behavior. And I think that's very important for people who are managing and running brands to keep in mind, because there's really, you're facing an environment where you are going to have to deal with this reality. You're going to have a plan in place to navigate this politicized consumer landscape. And if you don't, you're essentially setting yourself up to trip over a landmine and have some real problems. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Mercedes to talk about what you should do.
Grace. So as we assess those results that Chris just shared about consumer sentiment as it relates to both their political and social values, we also understood that for many brands who have been and will be investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that this climate may make it increasingly more difficult for them to know how to proceed. As you recall, coming out of 2020, there was this huge reckoning in society, and we had this mostly shared alignment on the roles that we as individuals and we as businesses should assume in reaching towards creating greater equality. But now there's been this introduction of a different and less progressive take on what we should do. Next slide. And so in the past year or so, DEI has increasingly, and I say that with quotes, DEI has increasingly become a political platform in itself, and it's been actually leveraged to create stronger division across us. Last June, when the Supreme Court overturned affirmative action in schools, we started to see those efforts being directed towards companies. Just 1 month after that decision, there was a letter that was generated by the same organization who were the petitioners of that Supreme Court case. They're the SFFA, called the Students for Fair Admissions. And that letter was directed towards Forbes 100 companies, urging them to stop their DEI efforts on the grounds that they were discriminatory. The following month, the same organization sued 2 law firms, challenging minority fellowships that they had created to actually improve their employee representation. And a month after that, they sued the Fearless Fund. And the Fearless Fund is an investment firm that was created specifically to invest in women of color-led businesses, which, by the way, for context, in 2022 had only received 0.39% of the $288 billion that was deployed by venture capital firms to startup organizations. Next slide. So now, despite this opposition that has garnered a lot of media attention, especially as we see it coming from a handful of very prominent and very vocal business leaders, it actually isn't at all reflective of what the vast majority of what American consumers actually think. So in fact, the weight of responsibility that they place on brands and companies to provide solutions for issues like social inequality and treating people of different ethnic groups and those who are LGBTQ+ equally is either very close or equal to the weight of responsibility that they're placing on the government to resolve those issues. And if this trend of DEI backlash continues as we approach the election, it will become an even stronger imperative for business and market leaders who have an arguably stronger collective influence than political leaders to continue forward with their plans to promote DEI. And there are several reasons why this would be beneficial for them to do so too. Next slide. First reason we want to talk about is because multiculturalism, which was once this very niche market that we were looking into, it's now on track to effectively become mainstream America. Gen Pop, America's diversity is continuing to expand at a rapidly accelerating pace on its own, as we see as the forecast for 2060. So that's already a done deal. So at this point, fostering inclusivity and equity becomes even more salient as a way of life for all Americans and how we live. And next slide. And when we look at our collective youth, and as a generation, Gen Z, they are so much more diverse than prior generations. They're more gender fluid, as we've seen. They're increasingly identifying as LGBTQ+. And so they're just more progressive by nature, because that's who they are. And they are the future of America in voice, influence, and of course, spend. And next slide. I want to get to the second reason it's important to continue to promote DEI, and that's because it supports the greatest asset that a company has, its employees. And it really pays off as it relates to improving the employee brand and the employee experience, all of those things that we care about. We see that within leading organizations that invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It didn't go unnoticed because 74% of employees who belonged to underrepresented groups were more likely to agree that their organization valued it. And 68% said they felt a sense of inclusion too. And 64% of these organizations saw a meaningful impact on their recruitment and retention too. And next slide. It's not only the employee brand that benefits. So DEI investment is demonstrated to result in greater innovation and financial growth too. And these leading organizations, it improved their competitive position, it improved brand perception, and there was actually an average gain in market share of 12% over 12 months. And many of them even beat their revenue expectations that they had by more than 10%. At Ipsos, we're very proud about our success in finding a lot of ways to unlock growth for our clients. And as you can see, this is one way that shouldn't be discounted. Next slide. So we wanted to make sure that in addition to showing the opportunity that DEI can bring, that we also provided some recommendations for companies and brands in navigating the backlash against it. And the first is simply starting with not just tactics or not just programs, but a DEI strategy for the organization. This is a framework that we use to illustrate how DEI should not just be compartmentalized. It shouldn't just be an HR strategy, or it shouldn't just be a product strategy, because we've seen it be most successful when it's employed as an integrated and centralized strategy that directs all of those company touch points underneath it. Over the past years, we've discussed how DEI is an a point in time exercise, and it has to change as we do, as the country does, as the market does. So given all of these things that are happening in the climate, now is a really good time to either start, or if you have started, reevaluate where you are and if and how your strategy may need to adapt. And there are 5 different pillars to explore. The first is orientate. And that's just really asking yourselves, what does the future of DEI look like now? What does it look like within this current conversation and what's happening? What does it look like for the country, within my industry, for my brand, for my employees, and for my customers, and even for the consumers that I want to acquire for growth? The next pillar is focusing. So asking should and or how should we reassess or reaffirm the DEI goals or initiatives that we've already established? Asking ourselves, like, are we still talking about the relevant issues? Because you don't have to focus on all of the issues, just the ones that make the most sense for your brand or company. And it's also asking, like, how do we prevent the erosion of our progress to date and the DEI investments we've already made? Because without a doubt, a lot of this anti-DEI messaging that's out there, like, that's exactly the type of messaging that effectively counters all of the unconscious bias and allyship trainings that we invested in and had our employees participate in around 2020, 2021. So, like, do we need to do things like that again? And then the next pillar is acting. So asking, what do we actually do in service of our employees and our customers? Like asking, like, what are the right actions that we need to take? What are the right products that we need to create? So on and so forth. And then talking, asking in light of current events, what exactly it is that our brand or our business leaders should even be communicating at this time. And then the last one is evaluate. So that's, asking, are we collecting the right data? Are we collecting data? and how we're leveraging that data to understand what's actually real and resonant for us in this moment. Asking how much do we really know about the progress we've made for our customers, employees, and where we might need to invest next. And next slide. But I do want to caution that we don't, what we can't do is just start with the talking before having even done the work. In some cases where you feel like the conversation might impede your progress, I'd say it's much better for you and all involved to do the work without feeling compelled to talk about everything rather than the other way around. So just be very mindful of that. And next slide. And when you do talk, when you do create your messaging, try to avoid the type of language and terminology that's being politicized as we see it. You don't have to necessarily use terms or say things like DEI. Instead, you can just focus on the impact that DEI brings. Like talk about your desire to adapt to a changing world and a changing marketplace, or your commitment to belonging and equality, or improving the representation in your organization that's a reflection of the world in which we live. That's a much less contentious message for the opposition to confront. Last year, we polled Americans to ask, how much do they support the teaching of critical race theory in public schools? And if you recall, CRT was the big buzzword at that time. As you can see, it didn't garner much support from most of the country, Democrats excluded. However, when you ask the same group how much do they support the teaching of the ongoing effects of slavery and racism in the US, the large majority of Americans did support that. Same concept, but different reaction and same result. Next slide. And then lastly, it's important to stand firm on your stated position. While corporate backlash is still a very real thing that we'll have to navigate, you should absolutely avoid changing course and walking back on the message that you've already put out there and communicated. So if you previously stated your DEI goals and intentions, you could possibly face a greater risk in changing your position. Over half of Americans believe that a corporation should stick by any decisions they've made to take a stand on an issue, even if it makes some consumers angry. And as we've seen from some of the brands who have done this, we've learned that changing your position could make them even angrier and have some detrimental effects. So next slide. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Mercedes. Thank you, everyone. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A field to enter them in, and we'll see what we have so far. All right. So first question, I think this is for you, Mercedes. Should a business just try to avoid politics altogether?
I would say it's less about avoiding politics and bringing it back to people. As we saw from that slide, as far as CRT and the wording that's used, people don't really have an issue with getting behind causes that are connected to humans and bettering humans. So just making sure that you don't bring politics into it, because there's always going to be a divide and a division there, and making it more so about the human foundation, which is something that everybody can get around. And that's the safest way to go.
Yeah. Next question, I think maybe I'll take this one. Is the push for brand activism driven more by one side or the other of the political divide? I think we see it expressed differently depending on the issue at the moment, but it is something coming from both Republicans and Democrats. I think there's a lot of examples of Democratic driven corporate activism, particularly during the Trump administration, where Democrats felt like the government itself was sort of outside of their power. There was a lot of push to essentially try to have businesses counterbalance that. And then for Republicans, you actually see more of that now that the Democrats are in the administration. I think that's an ongoing challenge and probably an ongoing phenomenon that whichever party holds the White House, you'll probably see the other side pushing the private sector more. But no, I don't think it's necessarily driven or dominated by one side or the other. Here's another example, another question rather. You often can't have it both ways, fix it and stay neutral. What does that look like? Not talking politics, like helping to clean rivers or lobbying for consumer-friendly regulation. What sort of ideas do we have about how to have it both ways, essentially, to provide solutions but not get involved in politics. Mercedes, you want to take that?
Well, again, I'd say I'd bring it back to the people. You can't have it both ways, but I find like with it, as it comes to politics and kind of navigating these issues, a lot of our political leaders aren't really doing a really good job of being able to draw that distinction either. I think we've seen, like, even with some recent examples of how politicians are asked about certain issues and issues that are a problem within this country. It's been very difficult for them to give kind of a straight answer because they're trying to appeal to two different sides there. So again, I think just staying close to the impact of the issue is the best way to try to balance that.
Yeah, and to extend on that, I think the question even has a little bit of it is things that are really focused on service, things that are focused on very material, real world impacts tend to be very positively received. So cleaning up a river is something that you're not going to really see anyone opposed to. In general, it is when you get into sort of the more abstract or the symbolic that you run more of a risk, because that's the kind of thing that can more easily be politicized. But it's hard to politicize taking old tires out of a river, right? That's a thing that everyone's going to be on side of. So it is the kind of thing that is generally positive. I think, you know, our corporate reputation colleagues would sort of tell you to really focus on things that make sense for your brand. So if you're in CPG, maybe it's about food, feeding people, providing, you know, food to hungry, things like that. If you're in you know, beverages, maybe it's about water. You know, there's a lot of different ways that you can provide very real, very tangible service and avoid a lot of the political buzzsaw. Another question, Chris showed how higher income people are more likely to select a brand for social reasons. Are there other key demographic differences like region, urban, rural, gender, religious affiliation, etc.? I mean, socioeconomic status is sort of the main driver. So it's, you know, income and education are sort of nested together. You know, it's hard to say which one it is that actually drives it. And then, like, actually engagement is the other one. So, you know, people who are more, who read more newspapers or are more active online, essentially people who are sort of more involved in the world are also going to be more likely to be driven by sort of values-based consumer attitudes. So it is sort of interesting that essentially the people who are sort of the sort of leading sort of engaged consumers, right? Sort of your early adopters, your sort of, you know, high net worth individuals. Those are all the groups that are going to be most interested in sort of the politics of the issue. So it is sort of a challenge. But the other end of the scale, right? People who are sort of lower income tend to be much more focused very much on the material sort of needs, you know, so it really does become much more of a, is this affordable? Is this attainable kind of thing? And much less of that second order political values based issue. Mercedes, if you'd like to add.
No, I agree with that. I was going to say, be careful with how that is interpreted, because a lot of that is also subject to who can make those choices to pay the premiums for products. It doesn't necessarily show the full picture of who doesn't necessarily support that, but those people are just in a better position to be able to do it.
That's right. Here's another question. This is the last one we have so far. My brand is currently being criticized for some of our DEI practices. What should I do? Mercedes, any advice?
Well, hopefully that there's a strategy, because I think that's one of the dangers. And if, you know, this is a conversation, I would, you know, happy to take anything offline too to understand a little bit more. But I find sometimes when companies do have less of a centralized strategy and more programs, initiatives, it's a little bit harder to figure out what to do next, because it hasn't been rooted in what makes sense for the brand. When there's issues such as trust or any other sort of like conflict or crises that a brand goes through, that is something that they can always kind of go back to or lean into, because that's a message that makes sense for them, is perceived as being authentic to them, and they're able to navigate that a little bit more smoothly. So I would just urge to make sure that everything is aligning very well, and then it's very easy to move forward with that.
Yeah, definitely. Those are the last questions we have. So if anyone else real quickly wants to put one in, certainly welcome. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. Again, this is based on a POV that is on the Ipsos website already. You're welcome to have that. Ellen, I believe, will be making this recording available as well. And if you do have any questions or want to discuss any of these topics at greater length, you can certainly reach out to Mercedes or I. We're certainly happy to talk. Otherwise, thank you very much and have a great day.
For joining.